Thanks for joining me today. It's been a while since I've done a YouTube tutorial on panoramic photography, and one tutorial that has been missing is how to shoot and edit a HDR panorama. Now, HDR stands for high dynamic range, which means you're taking multiple photos to create an image, and a HDR panorama is multiple photos of the same frame and then replicating that across your entire scene. It is much more difficult. And to do this tutorial properly, I'm splitting it up into sections. The first section, I'm just going to quickly talk about the gear that you need. The second section will be how to shoot the HDR panorama. The third section will be how to edit a HDR panorama in Adobe Lightroom and then export the set of images of each frame in Photomatix Pro and then stitch the panorama in PTGui. PTGui is my go-to program for stitching panoramas. So let's get started with the gear that you need. Now, the big difference between shooting a normal panorama and a HDR panorama is the complexity of this. It is very easy to shoot a panorama handheld, but when it comes to shooting a HDR panorama, you need each frame of each section of the panorama to be exactly the same. This is where holding the camera handheld can cause you issues. The slight movement between frames can lead to your images not lining up properly. Let's start with the camera first. I always shoot panoramas in portrait orientation. When you're shooting a panorama, you want maximum pixels. You want maximum definition. This is why we shoot in portrait orientation, because if we're shooting in landscape orientation, we're basically missing out on 3 frames. Instead of a 24 megapixel image in landscape, I could get up to 60 megapixels when I'm stitching it in portrait orientation. Second, when it comes to your camera, then my VR, which is vibration reduction, is always switched off. It is set on autofocus, but as soon as I've focused on my subject, I turn autofocus off. You don't want your focus point to be shifting when you're moving along frames. So I choose a position and I leave it at that across the whole frame. Next is, how do I shoot my panorama? I always shoot panoramas in manual mode. I also have a 1 second delay on my shutter button because I don't want to be holding my camera as the photo is taken, especially when you're taking a HDR panorama, because you've got 3 frames. You don't want any vibration at all. So that is how I set up my camera. Now, concerning f-stop, anything between f8 and f11 for a landscape panorama is good. The other 2 pieces of gear that you will need for HDR panoramas is an Arca Swiss rail and a panoramic rotator. The reason why you need a rail like this that you can clamp your camera on and move it slightly back from your tripod is you do not want parallax error. I'll put a link here on the video that talks all about how to find the nodal point. And you'll find in the description below all the videos on panoramic photography that might help you out. The next part is a panoramic rotator. This really is essential. If you're going to go into all the effort of shooting a HDR panorama on a tripod, then go out and buy yourself a decent panoramic rotator, because that way you know exactly that you're going to get a 3rd overlap on each frame. You're not wasting time making sure or looking through the LCD screen at the back there to see that you're a 3rd overlap. You've already got a 1 second delay on each frame, so you've got minimum 3 seconds delay from each frame. And if you're going across, let's say 10 frames, then that's a minimum of 30 seconds from left to right. This is how I normally shoot panoramas, from left to right. The times when I do shoot a HDR panorama is very early in the morning or very late in the afternoon towards sunset, because these are the times where your foreground and your background lighting will be very different. This is how I shoot a HDR panorama. So how do I work out the correct exposure to shoot a HDR panorama? I normally shoot a 3 image bracket. 1 image will be underexposed, 1 image will be correctly exposed, the 3rd image will be overexposed. It's the center image that I worry about. We look at this HDR panorama here of the Brisbane city skyline taken just before sunset. You can see that the sun is setting behind the center of the panorama. This is where I will take my meter reading from. I set up the camera and, for example, I'm using f11. I will set the shutter speed so that I get a correct exposure. Then I will set up my camera to take a 3-image bracket, and I'll take that 3-image bracket. Then I will go to the far left where I'm going to start shooting the panorama. So for example, here I'll take 3 images, bang, 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 and then I'll come back and I'll go all the way to the far right and I'll do the same thing, click, click, click. Then I will look at the center image to see how much difference there is. If there is a huge difference between my center frame, the left and the right, which sometimes can happen, then I will try to average out. This is why a HDR panorama is time consuming, but it is also well worth it. Because you're joining 3 images, it doesn't matter if where the sun is setting, your middle image, which should be correctly exposed, is overexposed, because when you're going to blend them, you can adjust that. What you want to make sure is that the outer images are too dark. So that is how I've set up to shoot HDR panoramas. Now let's go into Adobe Lightroom and I'll show you how I edit a HDR panorama. So let's now choose 3 frames where the sun is at its brightest. And if we look here, we're looking from left to right. We can see that in the first set of frames, the sun is quite bright, but not as bright as the second set of images. So we're going to choose those 3 sets of images, which is image 4, 5, and 6. We'll go into the develop mode and we've got 4, 5, and 6. So I select 5. 5 will be the center image. The first thing I want to do is lens correction. I go up to remove chromatic aberration, enable profile corrections, and you can see it's picked it up as it's a Tokina 11-16 mm DX lens. I used to shoot quite a lot of my panoramas with this Tokina 11-16 mm ultra wide angle lens. Then we go to the basic panel and here we select the picture profile. These days I like using Adobe Neutral because it gives me a normal profile and it means that I can add the amount of saturation, the amount of contrast, the amount of detail that I want. We've got Adobe Neutral. You can see the white balance here is set to has shot. I can go and click on the eyedropper, and when we're using the eyedropper, we want neutral gray. And I can see I've got quite a few buildings here. One building in the center here, you can see where my little eyedropper is. I'm just selecting it and you can see that I've got light gray there. I click on it and it's showing that my white balance is just over 4000 kelvins, which is slightly on the cool side. I feel that this is a little bit cool, so I'm just going to increase it a little bit. Not too much. I'll bring it back down to about 5200. When we go through and edit these images, we don't want to over edit them. Remember, it's a HDR image. So you don't want to edit a HDR set as if you're editing a single image. When we're editing a single image, that is it. It's a single image. When we're editing a HDR image, we don't go overboard in the editing. So I'm going to bring the highlights slightly down, increase the shadows a little bit, reduce the whites, a little bit of reduce the blacks. The texture, I'm just going to go up slightly. I'm not going to put any clarity on here. I'm just going to increase the clarity just slightly. Dehaze here, you've got to be very careful because if you have the slider too far to the right on dehaze, when you're going to merge those images, you're going to end up a halo around your structures like the buildings and all that. So be very careful when you're using dehaze. I'll bring the vibrance up to around 23. There, saturation, I'll bring vibrance a little bit more, 28. I'll bring saturation down to 21. Then we go down to detail, and here we're looking at how much detail, like the edges of the buildings, how sharp you want them, and how much sharpening you want in this. So if I'm on a PC, so if I hold the Alt button down, grab the amount here, and you can see in masking, if we look, the image has gone black and white. The more I slide the masking slider to the right, you can see the less amount of sharpening I'm having. Go all the way to the left, everything's white, so it means sharpening has been added to the whole image. I really just want the sharpening on the outer edges of the clouds and the buildings. So I'm very happy with that. Now we're going to synchronize these three images. I just go back to the library mode. Using the control key, I hold the control key down and I select the overexposed image and the underexposed image, right click, go down to develop settings and click sync settings. And here you can see what has been synced. So I want all my basic panels, the detail, lens correction and calibration. I don't straighten the horizon at all because I found that through experience this can create a lot of problems. And if they're not straight, then leave it alone, because when you come to merging each set of images, you'll find this is the best time of doing it. I've selected everything that I want here. Now I go synchronize, and you can see now that each of these images have been synchronized, the underexposed and the overexposed. So now we start with the underexposed image, and I select all the images that are underexposed. So that will be image 1, image 7, image 10, 13, 16, 19. And I click on develop settings, sync settings, synchronize. There, they're done. Now I do the same thing for the correctly exposed image. 5, 2, 8, 11, 14, 17, 20. Control Shift S synchronizes them. Yes, there. Now for the overexposed, that's 6, 3, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21. Control Shift S, synchronize. There, that's done. Now all our images have been edited. You can merge these images into a HDR in Adobe Lightroom. I don't do it because I have found that Adobe Lightroom, although it is a very good editing program, it still lags behind when it comes to editing HDR images or blending panoramas. So I have separate programs for that. I use Photomatix Pro version 6 to edit my HDR. So we select images 1, 2, and 3, right click, and in export, I go select Photomatix Pro. And here it says align images, crop align images, and the preset here gives you on tripod, handheld, minimal movement, standard, or large shifts. Because it was shot on a tripod, I will shoot on a tripod. And then click on reduce chromatic aberration, automatically re-import images into Adobe Lightroom. And the output format will be 8-bit TIFF, and I click on export. Now Photomatix Pro will open up. You can see now it's opening up the 3 sets of images and it's blending them together. So this is what it looks like at the moment. And you can see on the right, these are presets that you can choose. You can choose detail, balanced, realistic, photographic, natural, or painterly. I create my own. So I've already made a preset for this image. And you can see in all the presets down here, the one that says city, 0 city, I'll click on that one. And you can see the HDR setting here says detail enhance. The strength is only 35%. I don't go any more than 50%. If I go to 100%, it's going to add a lot of contrast. So I'll bring it down back to 35%. You can see my saturation is just slightly under 0. The temperature is just over. Brightness is at 1. I just increase the brightness slightly. Down at the last one here, blending, the opacity is the amount of HDR that you want. So I've stated that it's at 35%. At 35%, this is what it looks like. If I slide the opacity all the way to 99, then there is no HDR blend. You can see it's very different compared to at 0. And I'll bring it down to 15. I'm happy with this. Now to make sure that I'm using the same preset, I click on preset here and I go save preset, and now I'll click 0 CIT City -1. This means that that preset has been saved. There. Now I can go and say save and re-import. So that's it. Our 7th set of 3 images have been rendered into HDR images. Now's the time to blend them into a panorama. So I'll open up PTGui now. I go load images and it's showing me here the whole set of images. So we just select all of them, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, open, there they are at the top there, and I click on align. Now the next part is choosing the perspective that I want to make my panorama. I like using Mercator. Now remember, I'm going through this. If you want more detail on how to edit and blend panoramas, look in the links below. So now this is where we straighten the panorama out. And this is why I like using PTGui instead of Adobe Lightroom or free stitching software, because although PTGui is quite expensive, it is well worth the program if you're going to shoot a lot of panoramas, not just HDR panoramas. If I bring, these are the cropping lines, I'll bring the bottom cropping line in. Now I'm using the cropping line here has a guide for my horizon. You can see that there's quite a bit of curvature and it's slightly leaning to the right. So I'm just going to straighten the panorama out as much as possible. I'll bring it to the waterline. We can see that there's quite a bit of an arc in the panorama. This is because I was using an ultra wide angle lens. I'm not worried about the buildings, I'm worried about the horizon. I just want the horizon straight. It was shot with an ultra wide angle lens, so the buildings on either side are going to be tilted, but that can be fixed when we go back into Adobe Lightroom. I'm going to click on the center here with my left mouse button and just drag the horizon down. Now my horizon is level. If I bring the cropping tool on the side here, you can see that in the center here, the building is fairly straight, but if we go all the way to the right here, there is a bit of a lean. That's why I said we don't worry about that. Now we're just going to crop it. I'm going to leave all the outer edges alone. This is how I'm going to crop it. I can finish the cropping when I'm in Adobe Lightroom. We close this panel down and now we just go back to create panorama. And we can see here we have set optimum size. I go yes, maximum size, no loss of detail. File format, I definitely want TIFF. And in the settings here, it is 8-bit with no compression. I click OK. And the output file will be sent where your photos were edited in. And I click on Create Panorama. There we go. Now I can close PTGui down. Now I have to import the panorama into Adobe Lightroom. So now we import the HDR Panorama back in Adobe Lightroom. Before I do any final touch-up editing to this HDR Panorama and crop the image, the first thing I want to do is get my vertical lines straight. I go down to Transform, and in the vertical here we can see we have the grid. It's fairly straight, but I'll just straighten up a little bit more. That's all it needed, just 0.2. Now we go back to Basic Panel, we go to the Crop tool, we make sure that the crop tool is unlocked. I really don't want this part here of the boardwalk. I'm happy with this. Click enter, that's it. Now all I have to do is just finally touch up the image. So now I can add, if I want to, a little bit of dehaze. That looks pretty nice. I can lift the exposure up just slightly. I'm just looking to see if I need to do any more editing than what is there already. Let's increase the clarity just a little bit. That's it. I'm very happy with this image. And the thing is, with a HDR image, you've got to remember that you want it to make it look natural. The last thing I do is just export the image so that I can share it on social media. And this is the final image. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? You might wonder, what would it look like if it wasn't a HDR panorama? If you've gone back into Adobe Lightroom and correctly edited the middle frame, which is the frame that we chose to be correctly exposed, stitched them up into a panorama. So the image you see here is the HDR panorama, and this is the non-HDR panorama. The HDR panorama looks more evenly blended. The dark areas and the bright areas have been blended correctly. And if you look all the way to the left, just above the tree line, you can see that the non-HDR panorama, the highlights are blown compared to the HDR version where the highlights are not blown. And this is why I shoot HDR panoramas. At sunset or sunrise, where I have a dynamic range that is outside of the control of my camera. So the foreground was too dark compared to the sky. If you've got any questions, leave it in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a big thumbs up, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.